Recording in progress.
Okay, so thank you so much for letting me return to the Wood County Senior Citizen Center, as you call it. Right? It's always great to come here. And I was asked today to talk a little bit. Oh, for all of those who don't know me, I'm Stefan Fritsch. I'm an associate professor in the political science department. I'm at BGSU, and I've been there for 15 years now. So I think it's a sort of celebrations are in order this year. I did get a $25 gift card from and I was asked to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence because this obviously is a hot button topic, excuse me. And I will try to just lay out some of the I call it here the subtitle, negotiating technological, economic, political, and ethical challenges, which is a lot, a mouthful of words. But what it fundamentally really is that it's a debate that is ongoing. It's a debate that hasn't been going on for that long. It's very contentious. There are a lot of misconceptions out there about what artificial intelligence can do. Most people kind of know what it is. And so I'm just going to lay out a couple of things, and then I'm sure you'll probably have a ton of questions.
Sure.
Oh, sorry. There we go. So I thought I'd start out with a definition of artificial intelligence, and I'm relying on a mix because there are many different definitions out there, and so I rely on a Encyclopedia Britannica, and I mix it with parts of a definition that was provided by the high-level expert group that was implemented by the European Union in 2019. So this was a rather large committee of about 50 people from academia, industry, to think about sort of what artificial intelligence is. And they define it as the ability of a digital computer system to perform tasks commonly associated with intelligent beings, including the ability to reason, discover meaning, generalize, or learn from past experiences. So this is just a very sort of broad introductory definition. What it means in a nutshell is that we're trying to come up with computer programs or algorithms that can imitate the way that human beings basically think and reason. And we will see later that obviously brings with it all the usual challenges that we also face. Now, for anybody I would love to talk much longer about this. There are also some great books out there, sort of addressed more to the general reader, that demonstrate that we have been fascinated with this idea of creating artificial life forms for a very long time. I randomly picked 3. And so the earliest one is the one here at the bottom. So that's out of an Arab sort of account of, it's called the Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices from the 12th century by an Arab scholar. And it depicts basically what is known as a peacock fountain. So this was sort of an early form of sort of modestly automated water fountain. I then went to my wife and said, what can I use that is a little later. My wife is a professor in art history at BGSU, so I had to rely on her expertise. And she said, pick that automatic chariot that's actually, I think if I'm not mistaken, probably in the Schatzkammer in Vienna, the Habsburgian Schatzkammer. So that was a sort of an automated, it looks like, it moves by itself. You could sort of wind it up and it would move. The Habsburgs were great collectors of that kind of stuff. And then, so that's 16th century. And then in the 20th century, I chose an example of a movie that you, I'm sure, are all familiar with, Fritz Lang's Metropolis. Obviously, this idea already here is really sort of very sort of dominant of artificial life, right? In the form of Maria, who is a robot, right? So, in other words, I'm just sort of picked a couple of things to demonstrate that this is nothing new. We can even go back further to Greek mythology. If you think about Athena breathing life into clay figures, right? So this thinking has been, these wishes, these desires have been around for a long time. And so we just find ourselves in this, now we are sort of in the latest stage, right? Where we sort of try and push this in sort of the digital realm. Oh, sorry. So, again, just a brief sort of overview. I could go on forever, but we have had ups and downs, right, with artificial intelligence. I mean, as a field of inquiry that really deals with sort of digital algorithms, computer algorithms, the founding date is a 1950 conference in Dartmouth. Where sort of the leading scientists at the time came together and sort of came up with the term artificial intelligence. The 50s and into the 60s were sort of what we call the first spring of artificial intelligence research. People were very optimistic. There was a lot of funding available. People made promises they couldn't keep eventually, right? That's what was going to be possible with artificial intelligence. And so in the 60s and 70s, we see a sort of the first winter, right? Winter, basically, pessimism, nothing really is happening. Researchers are abandoning sort of artificial intelligence. Then there's a brief spring again in the 80s, renewed interest, followed by another winter in the late 80s, early 90s. And then from then on out, it just keeps going up and up and up and up. The main reasons for these ups and downs were always either limitations with computing power, right? So you ran into hardware problems, that the chips were not fast enough, and so on. The second problem was that the realization that whatever algorithms or language models had been applied at that point were not really flexible enough to deal with a wide range of challenges, right? In other words, a lot of these early algorithms were good at doing one thing, for example, like learning how to prove some mathematical formula or how to play checkers, right? And that worked nicely in a laboratory, right, where you could control all the variables and the environment. But you couldn't go out and, let's say, put it into a car, right, and let the car drive off on its own, right? So it was this sort of back and forth, right, that resulted in these different phases of optimism and pessimism. But again, generally, starting in the late 90s, we see that trend finally consistently move in the sort of the positive direction, meaning more research, more money, and also more services and products that come out of this eventually. So just to give you a little follow-up, more details, and I actually got ahead of myself. So we've talked about the 50s, 60s, very limited, right? Checkers, tic-tac-toe, and that kind of stuff. In the 80s, it was a lot of the money went into things such as language translation, traffic control systems, some biomedical information processing, right? So it's already things like pattern recognition in photos, like can the algorithm determine if something is a tumor, for example, right, on the image. There is some early efforts in neurocomputing. So you try to basically create computers whose hardware programming works more like our brain, right, which is sort of hyper-connected and can do many things simultaneously, versus computers basically do everything sequentially, right, one after the other. And then pattern recognition, control applications. So a lot of that had to do with industrial manufacturing, right? Making manufacturing processes more effective, right? The 90s really then become sort of the turning point, right? And now you might wonder, well, why is that? Well, there was this thing called the digital revolution, right? Where we sort of really started introducing digital technologies such as computers, right? But on a much broader base throughout society, right? We also had this thing called the internet that came around. And so with more and more information becoming digitized, right? So that means we are not putting it into books anymore, right? But we are basically creating digital files that are stored on computers, servers, right? And they're accessible throughout the world. And we actually create more and more information, right? You have to imagine that since the 90s, information production has grown exponentially. Right? It's the amount of information we have nowadays and that we have produced in the last 40 years is larger than anything we have produced before that. Cumulatively. So we drown, in other words, we're drowning in information. Right? And it's not slowing down, right? It just keeps growing. So on top of that, we also start connecting more and more devices, right? It's not just the computer and the internet. All of you have a smart, now we call it a smartphone, right? I still sometimes call it a cell phone, but that's so 2000 according to me. I was watching with my son the other day. My wife and I introduced him to 80s shows, and so of course I grew up on MacGyver back in Austria. In one of these shows, MacGyver pulls out a mobile phone that's about the size of a Walter. This was a mobile phone in 1988, and he just looks at me like, this is really weird. So we have smartphones. You have maybe a Fitbit or an Apple Watch. You have, anybody have a Roomba? So the vacuum cleaner inside or the lawnmower on the outside. Who has a smart thermometer? What do you call it? Yeah. Thermostat, thank you. Yes. Who has that at home?
No, thank you.
Okay. So some people, right? You all have assumed cars, right? With GPS. So we could go on and on and on. I made a social media accounts. You follow your grandchildren on Facebook maybe or something like that. So in other words, we are hyper-connected, right? It is seamless, it is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. We are a part of that. And every time we do something with these devices, or on the internet or on our smartphone, we generate data, right? User data. Location, what we like, what we buy, where we go eating, where we shop, etc., where we drive with our car. We create more and more data, okay? And that will, and we do actually, most importantly, we do online searches on Google, right? And so what happened was that we basically create so much data that companies like Google or Microsoft, etc., eventually said to themselves, okay, we got to find new ways to actually use that data, right? We know we're sitting on this ever-growing pile of data. How can we make money off that, right? I mean, it's America, right? Capitalism. So we got to make money. So let's use that data, and obviously it's used in commercially speaking primarily for targeted advertisements, right? I mean, you have had this experience just like myself. You look something up on the internet, and then you go and read an article on a news site, and suddenly pop, you have the advertisements. Well, that is basically an algorithm that has used that just created user data about the preferences, and so that information was sold to somebody else, and that somebody else said, I think that person might be interested in looking at X, Y, and Z, right? Let's push that target. So that's just an everyday example of how this works, right? Or if you might have heard about sort of echo chambers on social media, right? When you go on Facebook and you like something, then the algorithm thinks, oh, that, you know, Susie likes this, you know, so I'm gonna just push more and more of that content in the direction, right? Because that's the stuff we like. So what you need for that is big data, right? The more information you get, the more precise you can sort of shape the target, the ads, or any other type of information that you want the user to see, right? So that means what really happened, and that started in the 90s, and primarily Google was sort of the first company to really sort of realize the potential for this, was that you have to extract as much information as possible. The technical term for that is behavioral surplus, right? You basically leave a trail, digital trail, breadcrumbs, and Google can pick them up, right? And you multiply this by hundreds of millions of consumers and billions of searches and online transactions, and you just have this incredibly large amount of information, which is actually well with the term for that now, big data. Big data, and that can be sliced and diced and sold, right? It's traded like any other commodity in the world. Just talk to, and that's not just like online or companies like Amazon or Google. This increasingly is also used by real world companies that do produce like physical products. So if you talked to somebody the other day who told me, yeah, Owens Corning, they have just hired some new chief information officer, and they deal with AI, right? Because they also want to monetize all the information that they generate in their business operations, right? So it's ubiquitous, right? So you have more information, and now we can use that information to train algorithms. Right? So the big change, I don't want to go into the technical details because it gets very technical very quickly, and I'm still learning that myself. I'm not a computer person, a computer scientist, I'm a political scientist. But there were big changes in the 90s in the way that algorithms are structured, right? So we're getting closer and closer to having algorithms that are capable of teaching themselves, right? To learn. It's called deep learning. And the way they do this is they just absorb and digest exabytes of data. Well, and that enables them to recognize the image of a cat, right? Or a nose, or maybe even recognize a face in a public square on a, you know, where you get caught on a CCTV camera, right? So facial recognition, for example. These algorithms are used, you name it, and you will find an algorithm, right? Credit application, background checks, facial recognition. We have these algorithms in pretty much any product or service nowadays, right? Or in many, I could say, my toaster luckily is not connected yet, right? But there are fridges, right? That if your fridge there's no more milk in there, the fridge will remind you, or it will connect to some DoorDash or something. I don't know. So
I know that's.
so so it is ubiquitous, right? It's seamless. So most people are not aware of that or how this really works, including our students. They're all very good and, you know, surfing and using all those social media services, or platforms. But when you talk to them, and you realize they don't really know how this works behind the scenes, right? And that's true for most citizens slash consumers, right? I mean, whoever reads the terms of agreement when you download the well, yeah, but that's just one, right? But there have been studies, I mean, I think it was what legal scholars have looked at, because a lot of these terms of agreement will refer to other third parties that the service or the company works with. And so you would also have to read their contracts. And so they did can't remember what they chose, right? It was maybe Facebook or something. They said if they had read all of this, they would have basically, you would literally read till you die. Because it ended up, they had like 2,000-3,000 third parties they were working with. So that's a lot of paper, right? So at the end of the day, we all just say, yeah, agree, right? So, and that's one of the problems, right, that we have, that we use all of this, and it obviously generates a lot of positive outcomes, right? It makes life more comfortable, more effective, more efficient, but we don't really understand what's happening behind the scenes. So, and part of the problem is that this is mostly done, the innovation happens mostly in the corporate sort of environment, right? It is basically AI, when we talk about AI nowadays, then this is clearly dominated by private companies who do most of the research, who spend the big bucks, and who come out with services and products. And because they are so important, increasingly governments rely on these companies. All right, a big push in all of this was the war on terror. It started after 9/11 because governments all over the world were thinking about, okay, how can we improve surveillance? How can we, sort of gather information more effectively? Also on the internet, primarily on the internet, to sort of track what's going on, to potentially identify terrorist threats, etc. So where do you go when you don't have the capacity? You go to the private sector. And so there was a lot of money in that. These companies obviously were happy to help out governments. But in the course of that, obviously, they gathered even more information, right? So I'm sure it was a good deal for both sides, but it basically put these private companies into a very dominant position. And there are only really, I mean, there are a lot of startups, thousands of startups, but when you look at the big picture, there are only really a handful of maybe 1,000 companies nowadays that dominate AI globally, right? So, and again, they're almost like black holes, right? They attract not only investments, they spend most of their R&D money, they hire a lot of people, right? A lot of talent. Actually, I will show you, there's some data on that actually, right? So, and of course, it's a global competition too. Yeah, there are the companies, but then countries have identified this as a major source. I mean, information in AI and all of this, it's kind of like the how to describe this? That's like the raw material of the future, right? Most analysts think that that's basically what's going to shape capitalism and our society for the next 100 years, right? It's data and information. So there's a global race also between countries, right? To be on top of this, because that means innovation, that means jobs, right? That means technological leadership. And so here we have, that map shows us the distribution of startups. So these are young startup companies in the AI field. And obviously we're doing very well in that regard, right? The US is the leader in this race, no doubt. But because of that, also a lot of other countries are trying to catch up with the US, so we're not fall even further behind. And then a lot of things that have happened in the last 2-3 years, particularly in the Biden administration, the CHIPS Act and things like that, where the government basically provides a lot of investment incentives for companies to relocate to the US, right? that freaks out the Europeans, for example, right? They had to come up with their own public funding, right, for AI in order to prevent young startups from saying, maybe I should go to the US, there's more money available there. There's more willingness to take risks, right? So there's a global dimension to this too. And here we basically have a breakdown of corporate investment in that area, so AI, right? You see in blue, that's in dark blue are mergers and acquisitions. So that's when companies buy other companies, right? In order to that's often that's a common practice, right? If you're Google or Microsoft or maybe even Amazon, you're a big company and you might find a little startup somewhere that has come up with some really smart new thing. And you say, well, instead of me wasting $1 billion on trying to develop this in-house, I'll just make you an offer you can't refuse, right? So they buy up companies. They might also try and get a minority stake in some other company, right? Just to be in the loop. Then we have private investments. So these are obviously the risk takers, like in Silicon Valley or so, right? And then we have some public offerings too, right? Where we as shareholders jump in. So just to give a breakdown, but what we do see is the dramatic increase, right? I mean, it's like, the growth rate is quite staggering actually. So there's a lot of money going into this area now, right? This AI. Here we see where the AI talent goes. So those are PhD graduates in computer sciences, software development. And we have in red industry. So those are the private that get gobbled up by those big players. We have in blue academia still going, and then in gray government. And that's where I'm a little worried, right? That means when we talk about things like regulation, like for the government to stay on top of this, they're basically always 5 steps behind. And part of that has to do with that public service is just not as attractive. Right. So that raises questions of how governments can really sort of stay on top of this if they don't have the expertise. That's not just for AI. I mean, that's more generally a problem that the US government has these days, right? The deep state is not that deep, right? We don't have the human resources, so to speak. How do people think about this? So here we have basically, and that I know it's very small, but we basically have here a survey, public poll. The question was, products and services using AI have more benefits than drawbacks. And you'll see countries like China where people say support that. They say, yeah, there are not a lot of drawbacks. It's mostly positive, 78%. Saudi Arabia, India, and a bunch of other countries, South Korea, Italy is still at 50%, and then the United States comes down here. It's 37%. So there's some healthy, skepticism, right? Which is probably not unjustified, I would say. And it does raise questions, though, right? So to why? I mean, there are definitely a lot of positives, but there are questions that have to be addressed. And so again, these concerns you can trace back. It's not like they started yesterday. And they were not initially always tied to AI specifically. This had to do more with the growing awareness of people that what happens actually with all this information that we generate, unbeknownst to us. There are many sort of incidents that have raised the awareness levels globally. So obviously, that started already in the 2000s with hacks, right? Where computer systems got hacked, information got leaked. WikiLeaks was the famous one in the 2000s. That was a we call it a private actor, right, a non-state and a non-profit basically, right? That got really good in revealing the information that came out of leaks, right? The data breaches. We had the Edward Snowden leaks in 2013. So that, of course, had a lot to do with surveillance programs that have been run by the United States. Right? He leaked a lot. I mean, he was convicted of treason and all these things. Social media platforms sort of just added to the problem in the 2000s. We're starting in the 2000s. People, particularly in Europe, this was a big thing. People started getting upset that the specific case was a Spanish case where somebody had been convicted in a lawsuit, and then they had served the time and they came out of prison. I think that's what it was, and they could still find articles on the internet, you know, talking about that lawsuit. And the person was like, "Well, I've served my time. People still find these articles. It's damaging my reputation. It's damaging sort of my credit worthiness. I can't find a job." And so they sued Google. This case involved Google, and that became the sort of starting point for this right to be forgotten on the internet. Now, you can't do this in the States. That's only in Europe, right? Because the person won. And technically, you're not forgotten. You just have the right to tell the company you have to erase this and this and this, right? On the internet. Yeah, so that happens in Europe, and that's now sort of part of EU-wide legislation, right? That you have the right to get certain things deleted. Another big sort of turning point was the Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2018. So that was that came out after the election of Donald Trump, where this company, Cambridge, was actually sort of helping, sort of using Facebook data, right, to customize political messaging, right? So, and people didn't know that the data was actually used, right? And then they got bombarded with political ads, right? And that was sort of in connection with the Russian election interference rumors, right? So there was just a bunch of things that happened in the last 20 years that increasingly made us aware that this is actually, that there are dark sides to all of this, right? That we have to address. And so with regard to AI, the question really became, okay, there are a bunch of ethical issues and legal issues that we have to address if we want to sort of strengthen people's trust in AI, right? And so here I'm again going back to the EU's report from 2019, because the EU has come very far in regulating AI, actually, right? If this will play out on the ground and how effective this will be, that's actually part of a book project I'm working on. But I just thought this might actually be a good sort of brief overview of what the issues are actually. So, and this within the EU, the umbrella term here is trustworthy AI, right? So the question is, how can you make this trustworthy? What does it take? And first of all, human agency and oversight, that means that at the end of the day, I have to be able to identify somebody who made decisions with regard to AI, right? Because if you have a self-driving car, right, and that car hits somebody on the road, who do I sue, right? Do I sue the software programmer, the company? I can't sue. Who is ultimately responsible, right, for that error in judgment, right? When it was the judgment or the decision was made by an algorithm, right? So that's a very important issue, right? Similar thing in actually autonomous weapon systems, right? The Geneva Convention actually still declares that ultimately there has to be a human decision maker, right? That pushes or tells the system to push the button, right? But there's a trend to make more to sort of transfer more and more of the decision making to autonomous weapon systems. So if a drone strike results in collateral damage, right, civilians, like whose responsibility is it, right? Who is at fault here? So that's sort of an example from the military world, right? Technical robustness and safety. Well, you should make sure that the system can't be corrupted, right? We have instances now where algorithms were corrupted from the outside. So you introduce, so it's a self-learning algorithm, right? And I can screw the algorithm by introducing faulty data. It could be faulty images, for example, right? And then you sort of screw the whole algorithm in a different direction, right? And it might result in actually bad decision making. Privacy and data concerns. So that's the most sort of commonly discussed one, right? What happens to our data? Should we as citizens or consumers actually have the sovereignty over our data? Do we have a say in how this data is actually used? Right now, we just hand it over for free, right? Because we get to use Facebook or whatever for free, but we're paying with our information, right, in exchange. And it's really a deal we could argue with the devil, right? Because we also have no idea what happens with that information on the other end. You might have read in the news that there are a lot of publishing houses right now, authors, even media organizations that are contemplating lawsuits against Google, for example, or Microsoft, because they say, you're using our data to train your ChatGPT, like your generative artificial intelligence, but you're not paying us a single dollar, right? So you're free riding on all the information that's available out there. And, I want to see some money, right? Please, right? You also go to the bookstore and buy a book, right? Why not the same for training artificial intelligence, right? Transparency. So enabling the consumer or citizen to understand what is happening with the data, right? Giving it actually even explicit consent, right? You can see this quite often now when you visit web pages in Europe, where the server is actually the server is located in the jurisdiction of the European Union, and you get these pop-up menus that say, well, we use cookies and this and that, and you can sort of click, I don't want you to use this, and I certainly don't want the advertisement. Limit it to just the functional cookies that enable the website to work on my computer, right? You don't see it that often in the US, almost never, right? Because we are much more lax with the way we protect privacy. Right? So that's a big issue. Issues of diversity, non-discrimination, fairness. There was just a great story the other day on NPR as I was driving down from Toledo about facial recognition software that gets used by law enforcement, and research has demonstrated that the algorithms still sort of have a hard time with minorities, so people of color, Black people, or other minorities, right? And that has to do with, so there's discrimination built into the algorithm accidentally, hopefully accidentally. That has to do with the data that the algorithm was trained on, right? So if you have an unrepresentative selection of images that overwhelmingly show white people, right, then the algorithm is not that good in correctly identifying other people, right? People with other ethnic or racial background, right? It could be a credit application algorithm that looks at your postcode and determines, oh, you are, and let's say you're white, but it says, oh, based on your postal code, we think you're Black and you're a less reliable land acquirer, so boom, your interest rate goes up 3% because we think you're riskier, right? And so on and so on, right? So there are questions of that have to be addressed, right? Because AI has an environmental footprint, right? Since you've heard that too, but these data centers, right, that store the data that we need in order to train our AI and just for the internet to work, right? They use a lot of energy, right? You have to cool them. A lot of data centers around the world are located in really cold places, but that brings down the energy costs. But there's an environmental footprint to our information society, and that actually keeps growing because it requires a lot of energy to run the internet, to charge our cell phone, and so on and so on. So, and then overall, just, it all boils down to accountability. Who ultimately should be the responsible person, actor, right, that we can hold accountable? Companies, individual software designers, yeah, it's complicated, right? And so to conclude here, you have sort of the problems that there is always a lot of economic profit to be made from this, right? I mean, this is the future, technologically speaking. So you have this very strong profit incentive, and there are jobs, and no doubt about that. But how do you square that with our privacy concerns, right? Our right to actually be in charge of, or have it say in the way that the information that we create is used, right? And how do you address this legally, right? And at the same time, you want to do this with in a way that doesn't hamper innovation. Well, I have colleagues back in Europe who always say, oh, man, the Europeans, the first thing we come up with is rules and regulations and laws. And I wish the Europeans were a little more like the Americans, right? Risk taking, and let's see where this goes. And then he said, but at the same time, I wish the Americans were a little more like the Europeans, a little more concerned with the implications of all of this. So instead, it's this sort of loosey-goosey, let's see what happens. So there's that. Right? How do we get companies to buy into this? Right? I mean, if your whole business model is based on the use of information, right? Because that's the foundation of your business. And you're actually pretty happy that the consumer doesn't really know what's going on, right? They might have questions about this, right? And God forbid, a say in how we do our business, right? So how do you get companies to behave ethically and to produce ethically solid products, algorithms, services that are transparent when the whole business model thrives on the murkiness, right? So that's a big question. How do we resolve all of these problems while we still find ourselves as a country in the cutthroat competition with other countries out there, right? So China, right? For example. China doesn't have the same qualms about the ethics of AI, right? They use it very strategically, right? The Communist Party, you probably heard about this, right? I mean, there's not only ubiquitous public surveillance, like everywhere, but and with the help of algorithms, they track people, they see where they go, what they do, who they sort of interact with, what they consume, what their opinions are if they express them online. And based on that, or if they are good borrowers, creditors, right? If they pay back on time, and etc. If you don't, you get a lower social score. Social scoring is called, right? And so that basically I give you a numerical value. It's like, oh, you only reached 5 out of 10. You're no longer allowed to use public transportation. From now on, it's a bicycle to you, right? When you walk until you have redeemed yourself, right? So it's that kind of like punishment, right? That is supported by artificial intelligence in that case. And then the last question I had, sort of a challenge for us as humanity, is how far are we willing to go with this? Right? There's the debate of the singularity, which is of course a little futuristic, but the singularity basically is that point where AI would become sort of self-conscious, right? Like it would basically realize that self-consciousness, like understanding that it is a thing, right? And have the conception of self, right? Which is sort of the ultimate trajectory, right? I mean, if we make these algorithms smarter and smarter, and we're still ways away from that, right? It's not something that's going to happen soon, but people start thinking about it, right? If I push the smartness, so to speak, of these algorithms, like where's the end point here, right? And so the singularity sort of encapsulates this idea. It's basically like pop culture reference Terminator, right? Plus it's Arnold Schwarzenegger, sorry to come back. He was a visionary, he's obviously the but it's that same idea, right? It's in this case, in the movie, it's a defense system, right, that becomes self-conscious, right, and identify humanity as the source of all, problems. And so the goal is to eliminate humanity because then everything is perfect, right? So it's that kind of stuff. It's obviously scary, right? But that's sort of the challenge there, right? The moral, philosophical challenge that we have to negotiate. How far do we want to go with that? Would robots that are self-conscious be? I mean, you've probably seen iRobot. There are a bunch of Hollywood takes on that, right? Would they have to receive some human rights, right? Robot rights or something like that, right? Would we consider them equals, right? Or I mean, this is all in the future, but those are the philosophical challenges. I think, and that's probably what I had to say, right? So there's a lot of open equations at this point, a lot of challenges. We only know for sure that this is happening, and it's going to become more and more relevant because it's the foundation of our economic system.
I have a question, maybe it's a comment. You, on the slide about trustworthiness, that ship has sailed.
You can, I mean, the Europeans are trying to do that, right? So, I mean, it's law now, so it has to be implemented by companies.
And right? You asked how we can have the good trustworthiness. We have to raise good people.
That's right, or people who are at least aware that what they do, and sort of AI displays biases that are similar to human biases, right? So the AI is only as good as
person making it.
Well, yeah, not a moral judgment, but sort of a certain humility, right? And trying to eliminate these sort of biases over time, right? I guess that's my take on that, right? I don't assume that people deliberately say, I want to make a really racially biased AI, but it just happens because of the data that we use, right? So it's all about the quality of the data.
Is there any control over AI, or can it just grow exponentially?
It depends. Well, in Europe now, again, Europe is sort of at this point has taken the lead in terms of regulating it. There is also much stronger protections in terms of privacy in Europe. So we have a very strong legal framework for these kinds of things. But this literally just passed like a month ago, the AI. And I'm curious to see how this plays out on the ground. Like if you're a little startup and you have a great revolutionary thing, and now you have to worry about, oh, can I sort of guarantee all of these things over the life cycle of the algorithm, right, or the product? No, I'm going to go to the US because they don't worry about this as much. Right? So I mean, at the same time, you have to say that some regulators in the US are starting to sort of look at what the Europeans are doing. Right? I mean, if you think about California has come out with some regulations on self-driving cars. Right, that was inspired by, I think, in the case of California specifically, they looked at a German law that came out a year or two ago on self-driving cars. So we call this policy diffusion, right? Regulation is, of course, in this country sort of a dirty word, right? Because it's always considered a red tape. But de facto, they start looking around, right, and shop around for solutions that were developed in other parts of the world.
You mentioned academia. My friend is a professor at U of M. And they had someone not sitting after because they can have really good papers.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Mhm. Yeah. We have busted people in I have colleagues who have busted students for using ChatGPT. So that's this generative language model.
Is
Well, I'm a sort of, I have colleagues on both sides of the debate, right? Some say, okay, this is the new reality. We gotta embrace it because they might end up having to work with ChatGPT in their future jobs. So we gotta train them how to use it effectively. And what we're really talking about is you have to come up with a good prompt for the program. Right? The better the prompt, you tell the program, I need whatever, a 10-page essay or whatever, 5-10-minute speech on X, Y, and Z. And here are the main points that I wanted to put in there, and now go. And then you have to go in and edit it anyway, because ChatGPT is far from perfect. Language is a complicated thing. So there are those colleagues who say, let's better just integrate it and get the students to understand how to use this effectively, right? I, unfortunately, am still more on the other side. I'm like, why should I care reading what you wrote with a computer program? But at this point, we can buff them because the prompts are so bad, right? But the students, we can recognize it, and obviously for every ChatGPT, there is no account of ChatGPT available online. And so we yank the thing through the program, and it gives us a likeliness, like that this was actually written by a human being. We get a score, and it's all about linguistics, right? I mean, this is way past beyond my pay grade. I'm just a dumb political scientist. But we have those challenges, right? I stopped pretty much giving first of all, I do no more take-home essays, right? And certainly not online, right? It's all exams. I went back to good old handwritten blue book, right? And then assignments are designed in a way that makes it really hard to just say to ChatGPT, oh, compare the UN General Assembly speech of Iran with that of Germany, right? You have to sort of become a little more inventive when it comes to assignment. But sooner or later, we'll have to deal with that. We are already dealing with it. We want or not.
So the information that's being put into the AI, is there fact checkers? And is there also checkers to remove the information that they want to remove from basically the world?
So the problem is at the input stage, right? You have to basically, the way this is done, there are different ways to train AI. One is a labor-intensive process where you have human beings who actually label images. And a lot of that has been outsourced to poorer countries where we have a lot of cheap labor. So you can have people in Kenya, for example, that's all they do is they look at images and they label cat, fish, whatever, right? So if there's an error at that, I mean, I always label whatever image they see, right? But if I have too many images of cats, right, the program might be really bad in discovering an ant or something like that. So that's one way, but there's also the unsupervised one where basically the program, if you show them 1 million images of cats, eventually the program will realize, oh, that's actually a cat, right? I don't know what a cat is, but I know roughly like, I know that it has a couple of like whiskers, right? And,
Whiskers and ears. I'm a cat.
yes, you might need a cat. Yeah? But maybe this would do wonders for your social credit score. I don't know. So yeah, I mean, I think the main problem is, I mean, obviously you can go in and change things, right? But this is always very hard because sometimes the the programmers themselves. There are instances where the programmers are not perfectly sure what actually happens, right, with those self-learning programs, right? Because the algorithms have become so complex and because they're based on neurological models, there's always sort of the possibility that the program itself sort of generates something new that the programmer actually didn't consider in the first place. Yes, please.
It's scary.
I hear you use this word a lot and I've heard it used in many different ways. What is your definition of algorithm?
It's fundamentally a software program, right?
It's what?
It's software, it's a code, right? It's code that basically tells the algorithm how to process the information.
The algorithm.
Yeah.
Tell like
The software is just a line of code, like for any other software, right? And that's what it is fundamentally. Right? That's what an algorithm is.
a line of code.
Or many lines.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, you're right. A lot of code.
So it's something that's being used over and over again, or something that. you're
Yeah, it has to be written.
using.
Obviously, it has to be written by software
Right.
programmers, right? They do this.
And then once they see that you're using that same general type of rhythm, then they know that's what you're into, or.
Yes, so. Again, with the data they get from you, right, over time, they will be able to detect patterns.
Clue
Right.
words.
So it's all about the detection of repeat behavior, right? And that increases the predictability of your future behavior.
So that's why you should watch what you put on.
Well, if you buy a 10 Ford, the program will say, maybe the chance is pretty high that the next car will be a Ford too.
Yeah.
Right? So if you buy a Ferrari instead, whoop, I didn't expect that, right? But that's the danger, right? I mean, that's a problem. That's I mean, I don't know to what extent people, I mean, yes, we are creatures of habit, right?
Right.
But the point is that we have no authority over the way that our information is used, right? And it basically gets thrown back at us in the form of all kinds of things.
And the scary thing is, if you're using the same type of pattern over and over again, then they're limiting the other patterns that you might be interested
Exactly.
in or seeing.
Exactly.
But they're saying, no, you won't want to see
Exactly.
that, so they don't show it to you.
And that's, for example, the problem that we have on social media sites, right? That the algorithm, because it's become self-reinforcing, right?
Yeah.
So if I always click on whatever, the radical socialists on Facebook, that I'm not gonna get, maybe something else from the other side of the political spectrum, right? So
So you're not getting both sides.
it's becoming sort of more limited, right?
Yes.
It's a one-way street in an echo chamber or a bubble. And that's sort of a much larger problem, right? Because it's fragmented. The media world is fragmenting so much, the information environment, that there are a gazillion bubbles, right? You can go down many rabbit holes, right? And so there is no unifying. Like one of my biggest things is I have to teach students how to critically assess, sources, right? And that's a challenge nowadays, right? Because when I talk to some student and we talk about the war in the Ukraine or what's happening in Israel and Palestine, and I ask, so where do you get your news from? And it's like, oh, I follow this guy on TikTok, And what are his credentials? So I don't know. He just posts his videos regularly.
Class, maybe we should have the pattern be clear of critique.
Yes, sir, yeah. So, you have to start talking about verifiability, right? Is there actually fact checking, right? Are these people that have some sort of qualification? Or is it just really that random dude,
Mostly that.
So, it's got 3 cat videos and then that's yours.
Okay.
Yes.
My daughter said that when you said that, she says, so on our smartphones, we have more technology than the first rocket to the moon.
Yeah.
And what do? We look at videos.
Yes. Yes, it's true. Like we could have run the whole NASA, the whole Luna program on a smartphone, right? With more computing power. That's what I say, right? It's one of the challenges, right? As we're drowning in information, it becomes more and more important to learn how to assess, to know where to look for reliable information. That's a challenge. Like we deal with that on a daily basis, right? Also with our students, right? I mean, sometimes you see a bibliography references with like just a bunch of web pages. It's like, what is this? You know, like there's no author, no year, nothing. I have no idea what this is about, right? So you gotta train them, and this is a slow process, right? Produce quality art.
You mentioned that in the 1950s in Dartmouth, I believe there was a convention. What country was that?
No, there wasn't the US. There was in the US, Dartmouth in the US, at that small liberal arts Ivy League place. And those were sort of the founding fathers, like Norbert Wiener, John von Neumann. These were sort of the people who, I think Alan Turing was there too, the man who came up with the Turing test. Have you ever heard of the Turing test? It's basically, he was the one who proposed a way for, he said, if a machine or an algorithm ever passes the Turing test, means we, in our interactions between a human being and that algorithm, we can't tell the difference between an algorithm, if that's an algorithm, or another real person.
Wow.
So once the AI passes the test, we will not be, I mean, obviously without seeing, right? That doesn't involve seeing. Turing, Turing.
I think he might have been in the movie Oppenheimer. It sounds.
What is it? It's the Imitation Game. It's with Cumberbatch. Where
Yeah.
so Turing was also involved in Robert Turing cracking the Enigma code. That wasn't yet AI. He had to do it electromechanically. But the movie is great, right? I mean, but that's the guy.
I'm gonna,
Sorry, there was a lady.
About copying voice,
Well, we are already there.
yeah.
We are there. Right?
About protecting a child or.
But again, this is at the beginning, right? I mean, there are artificially created people on TikTok that have like 1 million followers, but it's all AI generated. It's not a real person. You know? Fake videos, fake voice, right? All of this, right? It gets very confusing and very hard to handle that, navigate that. Personal. There's more to come, for sure.
The real question is what happens when AI goes down? Do we have no act?
Well,
Things like that.
well, that's a general, that's a good question, right? So there's our dependence on all of this stuff, right? I'm not a doomsday prepper with my own nuclear fallout shelter, but I worry about it sometimes, you know, like, I mean, how many people still have a landline at home? Good for you. Good for you. My wife keeps talking about a landline, right? I was like, okay, let's get a landline. Right? You know, but that's it all is nice and good as long as it works.
Yes.
As long as there's electricity. I always tell my students, the moment our electricity grid breaks down, all of this is gone. There's nothing left, right? You actually have to talk to each other.
And people can't talk.
Yeah, well, there's that too, right? The socialization.
Yeah.
Right? If you want to put God's fear into a student nowadays, you tell them you have to make an oral presentation.
Oh.
That's the best. You see how the.
Yeah.
That's
And they're lost, they can't.
Yeah, we're just standing in front of a group of people and just talk.
these grocery stores lately, I'm thinking of Walmart right now because I'm on them. It used to be there were checkouts with people at them and you could check out there. They do have a wide variety of checkouts in the middle, however, they're not being used at all. Went in the other night at 7:30 at our Walmart here,
Mhm.
went to check out and I looked through all there was not a person in the middle. The only way you could check out would be if you went through the self-serve. At the self-serve at one end of the store, there was one person taking care of all those checkouts. At the other end of the store, there was one person taking care of it. So basically Walmart the other night had two people in charge of all the checkouts and everybody was doing it themselves.
Welcome to the new normal.
Yeah, isn't that creepy? And it used to be, you have a couple of those aisles and you thought, oh, well, the young kids want to go through those and the rest of it. It's interesting if they do have one of those in the middle section with a real person. Watch the hair lines. It's all white hair people or, I'm sorry, it's our senior people that are going. through it.
Yeah,
And then,
yeah.
if you have more than just one or two things, it gets to be a real pain going through the self-checkout.
I refuse.
No,
Refuse. They want
I asked
safety.
one young man why there wasn't somebody in the middle section. He said, because we can't get anybody.
Right. Yeah, so that's the labor shortage. Yeah, but I assume that the labor shortages are going to be the reason we will see even more of that, right? Being introduced to basically replace. And I mean, it's already a thing. It's not just at the checkout, right? I mean, there are all these projections about how AI, like robots and sort of automation, have sort of cut into blue collar jobs, right? And now AI is going to cut into what used to be regarded as safe bet white collar jobs. Right? If I'm a paralegal nowadays, I would be seriously, and I'm early in my career, I would maybe start looking around for alternatives. Right? I have lawyer friends who already use ChatGPT, right? To say he writes me the basic brief and I go in and I edit that stuff, right? AI programs to look up the reference cases, the cases that you need, right, in order to make your arguments, right? So you don't send the paralegal into the library, pulling out the, and it's more and more of that, like mid-level, anything that's mid-level sort of management. I don't know, right? But the assumption is a lot of that will become redundant. Well, look at the UAW strikes right now, right? I mean, a part of that has to do with the fact that it's not just about electric vehicles, right? That just generally require less labor because there are fewer components. But I assume part of that also has to do with the way that since I have fewer components, it's easier to automate even further, right? Look at the writer's strike in Hollywood. Right? One of the core issues is to what extent they will use AI, right, to generate content. So these are really hairy sort of issues that we have to deal with.